This is 5-color Widespread, and we're joined today by this deck's brewer, Nick Johnson. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Nick Johnson, as Ami said. I'm a brewer and deck builder and grinder out of Southern California. I like playing a lot of weird decks, kind of like this, combo decks, degenerate decks, weird control decks. But yeah, happy to be on the show.
All right, so is there any particular order you wanted to tackle this in?
For those who don't know and maybe didn't play with the card very much when it first released, Widespread Thieving, the mainstay card of the deck, is a 3-mana red enchantment. It has Hideaway 5, and it says, whenever you cast a multicolored spell, make a treasure token. Then you can pay Wooburg. If you do, you may cast the card.
Without paying for it, specifically.
Correct. So one of the big points about this deck, and one of the things people, when they look at this deck, their mind immediately goes to, like, 5-color Niv. And I think that's a reasonable comparison. A good way to think about it is like thinking about the engine differences. So Niv Mizzet and Widespread are both engine pieces to fuel control decks. And Niv Mizzet is kind of just basically like a 5-mana flying creature that can kill planeswalkers and will draw you like 3 removal spells. Widespread Thieving functions quite a bit different, where it lets you do more busted things. One of the things I thought was most interesting when I first started playing with the card was casting something like Valki, and hitting Valki off something like Bring to Light or Widespread is really powerful. But then we have another card that I think is kind of interesting and unique about the deck is Korvold. So Korvold's seeing a good amount of play in Junsack right now in Pioneer. Pretty powerful card, breaks a lot of the mid-range mirrors and lets you go over the top in a big way. Korvold specifically in Widespread Thieving lets you combo off in a way where you just cast a bunch of cards and keep churning through your deck and make this giant monster. Really effective win condition and really good way to end games when you're not doing Tibalt.
Can you go into the specific details of how that works, just for people who are having a tough time envisioning it?
Sure. So the ideal board state when you want to go get Korvold off of Bring to Light or cast off a Widespread Thieving is when you have 2 Widespread Thievings in play, and sometimes 3. So when you have 2 Widespread Thievings in play and you have a Korvold, let's say you cast an Abrupt Decay with District Lands. Both of your Widespread Thievings will trigger, and they'll each create a treasure token. And with those treasure tokens, you can sacrifice them and trigger Korvold. Those treasure tokens will make you mana, and they'll also draw you cards to cast more things like Abrupt Decay and Growth Spiral. And it lets you churn through your deck, getting more cards. And if you're casting things like Growth Spiral, maybe even that mana off of it, and lets you get to a point where you just have a bunch of interaction, and you can set up this basically a following turn where you have a bunch of pieces of interaction, and you just lock up the game with having the best 7 you could have and a giant monster and a bunch of mana.
Specifically, I've seen you have board states where you have like 2 Widespreads and Korvold in play, and you draw nearly your entire deck.
Yeah, that's pretty easy to do. And Korvold ends up being like a 30-30 or whatever. And because your deck plays cheap enough removal and interaction, like you play like 6 2-mana spot removal spells, you play things like Wandering Mind, you play Riveteers Charm, enough cards that will cheaply enable Widespread, but are also just like good throughout a normal control.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no way to give Korvold haste, right? So you do have to pass the turn, but presumably that's not an issue?
You need to pass the turn and then untap with Korvold, which can be seen as a downside, but at the same time, if you set a position to where if your opponent even kills the Korvold, you still have like 2 Bring to Life that you can use to get Sweeper or Valki and removal, you're able to craft a hand that does not care about Korvold but will still win with it. And the times in which you find Korvold are usually when your opponent has nothing to do anyway, because you've just continuously interacted them for the first 6-7 turns of the game. So it's usually like the last thing you cast, they have nothing, they pass it back to you, and they just die.
So, aside from that, to go over Bring to Light for those unfamiliar. So Bring to Light is a card that can fetch basically any creature, instant, or sorcery out of your deck as long as it costs 5 or less, depending on how many colors you pay for it. And specifically, apart from various like silver bullet things that you can grab with it, you can also grab the modal double-faced cards where the front half satisfies the mana requirement and then cast the back half even if it doesn't. So in specific, Valki will turn into Tibalt, and Selfless Glyph Weaver will turn into Deadly Vanity, so you can either fetch potentially game-winning Planeswalker or a Sweeper.
Bring to Light is the kind of card that the entire strategy is built around because it functionally just gives you 4 more copies of every card in your deck. You get to play one of like Silver Bullets or really powerful cards. If you look at the list, you can see like a couple of like important one-ofs. Escape to the Wilds is card draw. Korvold is a very powerful win condition. Selfless Swiftweaver, Deadly Vanity for a powerful sweeper. These things are really important for your game plan, and being able to just bring to light for them and always get to them is a big draw for playing this kind of strategy.
And is there anything else you can talk about in specifics for the one of bullets? Like there's a one of Clarion, the one of Riveteers Charm.
Yeah, so Deafening Clarion does a couple of things that you want. Clarion as a one of isn't necessarily even for like a bring to light target, but sometimes it is because you need to be able to sweep the board, but also maybe gain life off of something like an Omnath attacking. That's something that can come up. And it's especially important in games where you aren't able to resolve a widespread thieving, or you're not going to have time to be able to do so. Those kinds of cards are really important. Extinction events similarly so, because there are some things that need to be exiled. And if you're up against something like mono green, Extinction events are going to be really important because you can keep your Sylvan Caryatids alive, but still exile their Cavaliers, their Old Growth Trolls, and their 1-mana Dorks.
And talk about Riveteers Charm.
Riveteers Charm is like one of my favorite cards from Streets of New Capenna. All of the modes are good. It's either going to draw you 3 cards in this kind of deck because you're usually going to be able to do it with something like a Widespread Thieving in play and be able to net mana off of every card you get. Being able to get a rebate off of your draw spell and your removal spell makes a card like Riveteers Charm way more important. But it also just kills Planeswalkers, and in the 5 to 10% of the time where you cast it for the exile mode, it usually just wins you the game or puts you back into a game you are definitely dead in. Hitting your opponent's graveyard against Phoenix, when your opponent casts Can't Stay Away on the Greasefang, it's a huge blowout. Like, there's a lot of situations where exiling your opponent's graveyard can matter. And I've even done it against Mono Green when I needed to wrath the board, but then I charm to exile their graveyard in response to the Cavalier trick.
All right, and talk about Omnath.
Omnath is, for those who might have context for Omnath in a format like Modern, Omnath is just insane in those formats where it is a 4/4 that draws card and always just like untaps and like makes you a bunch of mana. It's not really the case in this format. We're only playing 2 of Omnath, and you're typically only going to be gaining life on it most of the time. If you are getting mana on it, that's great, and you're super happy about that, and you have a lot of things to spend your mana on, but it's just not that reliable and not worth really making a bunch of concessions to try and enable that when you can function as a real control deck and don't have to like do abusive things with a card like Omnath. A lot of the times it's going to either just be a 2-for-1 that immediately takes a removal spell, or it's going to give you 4 life return, which is fantastic in a lot of matchups.
So is it mainly a stabilizer against aggro decks?
More or less, it's like one of the best jobs it does. 4 is an important point in the format. There's a lot of 2 and 3 point removal or 2 and 3 power creatures that it gets to threaten to block, and giving you the card, the velocity against the aggressive decks also matters a lot, because you usually need to get to things like your 5th land and bring to light in those matchups, and getting the extra card off Omnath lets you get there.
So I want to talk about a couple of these random 2 of cards. Like, I understand when you have a playset of something or when you have 1 of Silver Bullets for Bring to Light, but specifically, why do you have 2 copies of Tibalt instead of just 1?
So Tibalt is a card that, if it goes unanswered, just wins the game on the spot. But your opponent's also aware of that, and they're going to try and kill it on sight. Against decks like Black-Red Midrange, they're usually going to have maybe 1 or 2 ways to kill something like a Tibalt, either with the board state or something like a Dreadbore. So having access to the second one in your post-board games can be really powerful. I've actually played versions of this deck that have played 3 Valky, just because finding it and casting it was reasonable, but also tutoring for it 3 times came up a good bit. And a similar thing with Glyphweaver. I've definitely played versions with 2 Glyphweaver. But for other cards like Wandering Mind is just a card that you get to play in this kind of deck that is just incredible. Very good at finding Bring to Light and Widespread Thieving, and when you have a Widespread Thieving in play, it gives you a rebate too. Like a 2-mana dig 6, like it's basically dig through time at the point, but it also blocks. That kind of effect is something you want, but you don't have infinite flex room for unless you're playing something like Yorion. Yorion just gets so many more flex slots.
So is the reason for there's like the 2 of Tibalts and the 2 of Omnaths, but there's only 1 Korvold? Is that because when you're going for Korvold, you're probably either winning the game or you're drawing so many cards that it doesn't matter if it's answered?
That, but also the fact that Korvold is only good when you're winning, whereas Omnath can be good as a threat to attack control decks, or it's really good at stabilizing a board. Bulky, reasonably enough, can be cast on the front side in matchups where you need to interact with them early, but you have kind of like a slow hand. Being able to nab something like an Adeline or a Vizier of Tumbling Sands, or even just putting a 2-1 into play to attack and start putting pressure on your opponent can matter. Korvold just doesn't do any of those things. Korvold is just an engine piece that lets you end the game on the following turn or set up a board state where your opponent needs to kill it that turn or lose. But the fact that it's a 5 up also doesn't help in a format.
Do you ever cast Selfless Glyphweaver on the front side?
When I draw, absolutely.
So lastly, there's 2 Abrupt Decay, 2 Dreadbore, and 2 Vanishing Verse rather than like 3 or 4 of any of those. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Part of the thing is with this kind of strategy is that filling out your removal suite can be pretty granular and pretty difficult to manage week to week, because this is a kind of deck that I am actually like going to be playing continuously more, and it's tough to be like, oh yeah, this week I'm going to need more Abrupt Case because I'm expecting more decks like Greasefang and Adeline decks, or I want more Vanishing Verses because I think I'm going to need to kill like a Wandering Emperor or something. Having this split, Dreadbore being a kind of card that basically kills anything you want, but being sorcery speed is fine. Vanishing Verse being an instant speed card that hits a certain range of things, and Abrupt Decay being better against like things like spirits. Having that kind of split is also part of my deck building philosophy, where having more powerful one-ofs and having more powerful cards to either find or draw into is more important than just playing a condensed, lean version of a strategy. And to go off topic for a second, there's like a subject of some debate on like whether or not it's worth playing one-ofs. I'm personally of this philosophy of playing things like one-ofs and two-ofs more. But
Are you talking specifically in decks that don't have things like Bring Delight to tutor them?
yeah, even in decks without things like Bring Delight, without tutor effects, but especially in like things like Xerox deck.
Okay. And so the land base, I want to go over that before getting the sideboard. So when I take a look at a land base like this, or rather, let's back up. So when I look at a deck like this, I see every color, and I see every color pretty spread out. So immediately, building a mono base for this has got to be pretty difficult. And then when I come down here, we've got 26 lands, and it's a big mix of shocks, check lands, triomes, and they're like all over the place in different color combinations and different amounts, and none of them are more than 3 copies of anything. Can you talk about how you put a land base like this together?
Yeah, so mana bases for 5-color decks are inherently challenging, especially in a format where we don't have like fetch shock mana bases, where it's like your mana isn't just free, you have to play some amount of tap lands. I find it significantly more interesting to build mana bases in this kind of context, because otherwise it's just you play all the things you need and nothing more. For specifically how this mana base was built, we focused on trying to build with the mindset of trying to cast Sylvan Caryatid or removal spell on turn 2 a lot of the time. So we're playing a lot of black triomes, and we're only playing like 1 Rogran triome and no Ketria triomes. We have enough untapped green sources with things like Rootbound Crag and Sun Petal Grove to be able to make sure we can still cast Caryatid onto, but having the black mana is really critical for this kind of deck. Everything else is more or less basically hitting our numbers. We want to make sure we're hitting so many white and blue sources and red sources. Red being the least important color from my philosophy. You are basically just trying to cast Omnath or Deafening Clarion early with it a lot of the time, if you don't have like a Caryatid, and then Widespread Thieving on 3. And that's fine. There's a lot of matchups where you can't cast Widespread Thieving on 3, or you need a Caryatid to cast it, and that's okay. Widespread Thieving is just like a powerful thing to do a lot of the times in like the mid-range and control matchups, or a really powerful clock against combo decks. Against things like aggro decks, it's something when you get the time for it, you cast. So that's less of a concern when we're building our mana base, and that's something we've been trying to keep in mind.
So when I look at something like this, I see like there's Blood Crypt and Dragonskull Summit, or Watery Grave and Drowned Catacomb, but then there's Rootbound Crag, but there's no Stomping Ground, there's Sun Petal Grove, but no Temple Garden. So when you build a deck like that, when you build a mono base like this, is it just a lot of testing, or is there actually a way to like mathematically break down which of each you need?
So There are organized and particular ways to do the math behind mana base building. When my friend and I usually build mana base, especially for decks with like really strenuous mana bases like this, we actually go a little gorilla and build a spreadsheet and like map everything out, and then do playtesting. And over like a least a medium-sized aggregate of over at least 100 games, we start to measure like when we're missing certain pieces of mana based on play patterns rather than just like mana costs, because there is the math of like the mana costs versus your mana sources, but then there's also just like understanding the play patterns of your deck and knowing when you're going to need to cast certain spells, because it's totally fine to cast something like Widespread Thieving on 4 or 5, but you need to be able to cast Carrion on 2. That's the sort of thing like where reading between the lines on a mana base isn't so obvious. That's one of the important things I've been keeping in mind, is like we'll do our math on a mana base, but then we will also make sure we're understanding play patterns as well, because that's going to be more important a lot of the time.
Lastly, on the mana base, so there's one basic island and one basic forest. So I understand why you need at least one basic, because you need to have something to find off like Field of Ruin effects or Assassin's Trophy. But why do you have two basics as opposed to like making the island Odawara?
We've found that games go long enough that either a second Field of Ruin effect will come up, or it's really easy to draw the basic before you would have that effect come up. But also just like having an untapped land that unconditionally comes in and doesn't hurt you is also important. So that was like the argument for the forest. And I think the basic that we came up with as the island as the second one just made the most sense with Wandering Mind and Bring to Light and how the rest of our mana base is built. So I think two basics is totally reasonable. I think there's other strategies where they would build a mana base like this, but they wouldn't play any basics. Like I think something like Esper Greasefang, one of the other decks I had been fiddling with earlier in the season. It plays around 22 lands, but it plays 0 basics in it at Otawara. I think those kind of strategies that are trying to be lean and mean and not care about Field of Ruin makes a little bit more sense to play 0 basics. But I think playing a second one in a control strategy makes sense.
So to go back to the deck a bit, so obviously you mentioned earlier that the deck looks very similar to Niv to Light initially. So what are the big differences between this deck and Niv to Light, and why would a player want to play this over that?
There's a couple things in the difference between this kind of deck and a deck like Niv to Light. Niv to Light is a kind of deck that's kind of very barriered on what it's capable of. You have a very stringent set of deck building rules on like what you get to include in your deck spell wise because of how Niv works. Like you have to do the math on like how many average cards you're going to need and what sort of context and quality of cards you're going to need. Whereas with Widespread Thieving, it cares a good bit less, and Widespread Thieving also lets you grab things like Valky and tricolor cards. Like one of the reasons why you get to play Riveteers Charm is because you don't care about having it being 2-color. One of the interesting things about Widespread Thieving specifically is you can do some really weird stuff with it if you want. Some of the weird card choices I've played have been cards like Zakama, the Kami War, Dragonlord Atarka. You can play the Ultimatums if you don't want to play Gigantha. And I think those kinds of cards have a home in some metagames, but it just, the format has become so lean and so fast-paced, I don't think you get to do that anymore. But specifically with Widespread Thieving, when you untap with it, lets you keep pace with everyone, which is not something that happens with Niv to Light. Against Phoenix in post-board games, that matchup is very close to unwinnable unless you draw multiple Go Blanks and Dovin's Vetoes. Whereas in this kind of strategy, you can untap with the Widespread Thieving, interact with every single thing they do, and then just pop off on the following turn. And that's not something Niv to Light does. Niv to Light can't pop off and just like generate a big board state or make a bunch of mana. It just like kind of casts a 6/6 or it casts Tibalt. And that's good. Like those are powerful things to do. And like we're still playing cards like Tibalt because they can win the game on their own. But being able to do something a little bit more degenerate, I think is important in this kind of metagame. If you're going to keep up with decks like Phoenix or like Mono Green or Mono White, I think you need to be doing something a little bit busted. And Niv just isn't it to me, but a deck like this really is.
All right. So let's talk about the decks. What are the deck's weaknesses and issues, and then we'll get to sideboarding.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the format, I had this deck in my back pocket for a while, and I didn't want to play it at the beginning of the format because Mono Green was everywhere. This deck kind of struggles with a deck like Mono Green because Mono Green goes over the top of you, which is not something basically any other deck does. And it does so very quickly. And you don't have a lot of great axes of interaction that actually matter. Cards like Vanishing Universe are really good at answering permanents like Old Growth Troll to stop their like density from getting a bunch of mana off Nykthos, but you don't have a whole lot. You just don't. And that's just kind of a function of the deck. Another strategy that you can lose to pretty easily is like small creature decks. Like if decks are trying to go 1-drop and a 2-drop and attack you for a lot, like that's something you can lose to. So things like Absent Greasefang or Mono White can be a struggle. You really prey on the mid-range decks though. The mid-range decks and the control decks really just kind of get destroyed by you. The control decks are a great matchup, and mid-range decks, even just like if you talk about like Bring to Light versus Black Red, Bring to Light, like the normal Nib to Light matchup is very good for the Nib to Light side. And we do something even more busted, and Widespread Thieving is not a permanent they can answer. But then there's like decks like Phoenix, and Phoenix is a deck that you can struggle with, but you do have some powerful proactive strategies. One of the nice things about a deck like this is you get a lot of agency with your sideboard. Whereas some decks are kind of like cut out to playing only certain cards, like the mono white decks only get access to like a couple wedding announcements, some rest in pieces, maybe a planeswalker or two, and like they don't have a whole lot of other tools to reach for. You can play literally anything. So I like playing some weirder cards. I'm playing like a Notion Thief in my board. I've played cards like Azor the Lawbringer. I've played cards like the Ultimatums and Zakama, some weird ones. Another type of philosophy like deck building, trying to go into a tournament. If you're trying to win something like an RCQ, where people are just going to be playing good decks and be ready for the popular decks, it really pays off sometimes to just throw a curveball. Not everyone knows the play patterns around Korvold plus Widespread Thieving. Not everyone knows that you can just die from somewhere if you let them untap with certain permanents. So if you're trying to win an RCQ, even if you don't want to play a deck like this, I would definitely suggest trying playing something weird. Try play something people won't be ready for, and that's something you can explore on the sideboard.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got Deafening Clarion, Culling Ritual as sweepers for aggro, I'm assuming, Rending Volley for aggro, or like Greasefang, Veto for control, I'm guessing, or just like any spell deck like Lotus Field, Go Blank, similar.
Phoenix is like one of the big ones. Being able to counter like Pieces of the Puzzle or Treasure Cruise is one of the ways you can definitely win a game, because they do need to generate enough resources to continue going. If you can halt them, if you can go Veto into Go Blank, the game's usually just over. Basically, blue cantrip decks or combo decks. You don't need Veto against things like Control. Definitely a great tool to have access to, but like the matchup's already good enough a lot of the time.
I presume Notion Thief is just for like any blue card draw deck.
Great against Phoenix. I'm mostly playing it because I just like playing it for the memes. But man, when you catch someone galvanic cruising and you cast a Notion Thief, their soul just fades from their body. And it's hilarious to watch in real time.
And what is Void Rend for?
A principalistic thing that I like to approach from these kind of decks that can definitely go over the top is playing more cards that are catch-all answers. And Void Rend kills basically everything except for like man lands. Having an answer in decks where like you need to just become more interactive post board, not even necessarily in a particular direction, just more interaction is that's what a kind of card like Void Rend's good. Also, not being able to be countered, really nice against cards like Teferi or hitting like a thing in the ice against the Phoenix decks. Those sort of interactions matter a good bit. But basically, I wanted access to another removal spell. It being more expensive was fine in the post-board games, because the post-board games are just going to slow down as just a consequence of how post-board games go. And just having something that's unconditional was really appealing to me. And I'm playing a more narrow removal spell in Rending Volley because I need to kill things like Adeline. I need to kill things like Greasefang, and they need to just die now.
So, what are some cards that you're not currently playing in this list that you've played in the past or you strongly consider? Like, I know you mentioned Zakama, Azor. So, can you talk about those?
With this kind of deck, you get a really large, awkward card pool, and your big choices are understanding where a metagame's going to be and basically where the line is so you can just be over top of it. The week I was playing this, I just thought that the format was super lean, so I'm just playing as much cheap removal and cheap like rebate kind of interaction as I can. There have been a lot of times where I've playing something like Zakama is really good because either A, I need to hit it off of a Widespread Thieving because I need to win the game very, very quickly, or it's going to be castable as a threat just like 4 or 9 mana sometimes, and that is a consequence where I can just play Zakama and it wins me the game. Some of my favorites are definitely things like the Kami War. Zakama is very fun to do it with. Cards I'm looking forward to, and I'm probably going to be playing in this list, are things like Ertai, Resurrected, and Namada, Primeval Warden. As a brief aside, like Kalidas is a card you kind of want. It's really good against things like sack and aggro, and it's just like a super powerful sideboard card for this kind of deck that doesn't play a whole lot of things that want to be targeted with spot removal. Kalidas wasn't something you could play with Jegantha, and playing 80 cards for a card like Yorion is a little bit rough. But Namada, being a Kalidas effect, where it makes extra blockers, exiles, Cauldron Familiars, and such, is really important for this kind of strategy, because you play a lot of sweepers and cheap removal, and sticky creatures really are a pain. But being able to exile them and get something back in return, huge, lets you stay alive and stabilize way more boards, and not losing your companion for that kind of card is critical. It's huge, because Jegantha, kind of innocuous in a bunch of other decks, Jegantha is huge in this deck. 1, spending 8 mana on that kind of card is not a big deal. 2, it being easy to cast does matter, whereas like you can have some draws where you drew Glacial Fortress from Fiend's Tower and you don't have a lot of extra green mana, but being able to just cast Jegantha regardless of what you have is super helpful. But there's a bunch of weird things you can do with Jegantha, like happen to cast Omnath and do a follow-up play, or using it to pay for your Widespread Thieving and then immediately cast something like a Tibalt way ahead of schedule. Yeah, Jegantha does a lot of interesting things, and having to lose that kind of effect for something as almost innocuous as like Kalidas, it just isn't worth it. Like Jegantha does so many things that the deck wants to do, and it's a big beefy blocker, and it can attack and kill planeswalkers. Like it checks too many boxes for you to want to sacrifice that slot for that card. Especially since you get access to it game 1, it's a free card. Companions are still busted, everyone. Shocker.
That's most of what I wanted to go over for this. So let's talk about the tips and tricks with that you can do with this deck, like things that might not be obvious. So like the thing that immediately comes to mind that I've seen you do is that Bring to Light triggers Widespread Thieving twice if you grab a multicolor card because it casts the card.
Yeah, being able to exile and then cast the card, meaning if you grab a Valky and then cast Tibalt, you still get an extra treasure. That sort of play pattern comes up a lot. Being able to, when you have a Widespread Thieving in play, having 5 mana, you go Bring to Light for a Tibalt, you kill something and have a removal spell for another thing, lets you clean up boards you otherwise wouldn't be able to without grabbing a sweeper and losing a threat. There's a bunch of other things. I've actually got a full list. Let's go over some of them. Jegantha has a bunch of cool things it can do. One of them being, when you exile a card with Tibalt, you can cast it. Being able to cast those cards, you can spend any mana for them. Jegantha mana is, in particular, says you cannot use this for generic mana costs, but you can spend any color of mana. So you can have a card exile to Tibalt, let's say an Adeline, and you can spend any 2 colors of Jegantha mana to help cast that. Or anything, really. I have used Jund mana before to cast a Temporal Trespass that I exiled of my opponent's deck, and then use the 2 mana that I still had left over from Jegantha to protect it with Veto. Like, those are the kinds of things you can do with that interaction. Another important thing to remember, Deadly Vanity has to keep something alive. You cannot choose 0 things, you have to keep something alive, so keep that in mind when you go to search for it. If your opponent has a full board and you have nothing, they're going to keep their weakest creature, but that creature can still kill you. If you have a character that you got to cast on 2, you're having a much better time. Widespread Thieving also can be paid for with the Jegantha mana that I mentioned earlier. Being able to tap Jegantha to have mana to still do everything else with your turn when you don't need the attacker or blocker can be really important. Remember that you can also stack your Widespread Thieving triggers however you want, unless you're playing on Magic Online, which still bothers me. But you can Widespread Thieving and put the triggers however you want and generate enough treasures to cast the card you want to cast off of a Widespread Thieving. So if you have 2 in play, you can stack 1 first and then cast the one you need to. That comes up sometimes in like mid games against mid range, where you're going to have like not quite enough mana, but you can over 2 turns maybe generate just enough and then get a rebate back off of a gold card that you cast potentially. Some little more particular things, if you don't think you're going to sweep early, like cast like an Extinction event or a Deafening Clarion, I would recommend casting your Sylvan character before your Growth Spiral, just because it's a blocker and it fixes for any mana, whereas Growth Spiral like needs to hit a land specifically. Also, don't be afraid to cast Valky on the front side. Casting Valky on the front side in your linear matchups is really important. If you snag a Vizier, sometimes you can just steal a free game.
Do you ever activate Valky's X mana cost ability?
In the games where I cast the front side, yeah, I do a reasonable amount of the time. If I steal something like an Adeline, it makes for a very good blocker. If I hit something like a Vizier, being able to turn it into a Matador can come up. In a lot of other circumstances, it's usually just like denying my opponent a card. But it definitely can come up. It doesn't come up a ton, but it definitely does. There's a bunch of like weird things you can do with like weird cards as well. I was definitely playing a version of this that was playing more elementals. It was a Yorion deck with Risen Reef and Yorick the Desecrated, and you can do some weird things like a multiple Risen Reefs and casting a Yorion and putting everything into play and getting a bunch of treasure triggers. And in your end step before you discard, you catch a bunch more spells. Like there's a bunch of ways you can build the deck, and there's a bunch of different things you can do with these kinds of cards. Another tip or trick, I guess, don't be afraid to play a weird card. Don't be afraid to cast something like Battle of Frost and Fire. Play some weird things. Have fun with the deck. The deck's super cool. It doesn't have to be good to be fun.
Something I noticed that you didn't mention is that Widespread Thieving's trigger lets you cast the spell at instant speed if you cast like Growth Spiral or something to trigger it.
Yeah, and being able to cast something like a blocker, like an Omnath, can come up, or an instant speed sweeper can often be a blowout. Or some things as innocuous as just like trying to cast something on your opponent's end step to pay it out of a counterspell. Yeah, like that sort of thing can be a little non-intuitive, but pretty cool, and like helps create weird divergent play patterns.
It's definitely a very sweet deck. Like it's very cool, especially watching you play it. All the matchups that I see you play are always very interesting.
There's a lot of play to the deck, both before you sit down for a game of Magic and after. You can kind of design it however you want. However you want to play the deck, you can probably do it. There's just like certain things you have to keep in mind if you want to stay competitive. This is definitely one of those kinds of decks where if you want to try and win a tournament with it, you have to be paying a lot of attention to the metagame of where it's going. If you aren't able to keep up with that, maybe just play it for a weekly and it'll be a ton of fun. But if you want to try and win a match of Magic or a tournament match with this deck, be a little bit more observant and studious.
Well, thanks very much for joining me today and talking about the deck.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a ton of fun.